The slap landed so hard, the entire diner went silent. Not the kind of silence that happens when a plate shatters or someone drops a tray. This was different. This was the sound of people realizing they had just witnessed something that couldn't be taken back. "Don't you dare talk back to me," the man said, his voice sharp, shaking with entitlement. "People like you should know where they belong." The elderly woman he'd just struck stood perfectly still. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't reach for her face the way most people would. She simply looked at him, steady, unflinching, and said quietly enough that only those closest could hear, "You're making a very serious mistake." A few seconds earlier, no one in Maple Street Diner had known her name. Now half the room was already pulling out their phones. The man who slapped her, Charles Whitmore, adjusted his tailored jacket as if he'd merely corrected a misbehaving child. He glanced around, daring someone to challenge him. No one did. Not yet. Years of wealth had taught him something dangerous. Most people confuse money with authority. What Charles didn't know, what no one in that diner knew, was that this woman had spent her entire life being underestimated, and that underestimating her had never ended well for anyone who tried. Her name was Lillian Brooks. She was 73 years old, a retired public school teacher, widowed, soft-spoken, the kind of woman people overlooked in grocery store lines and spoke over in meetings until they learned who she really was. Every Tuesday, without fail, Lillian walked 6 blocks from her apartment in Harlem to Maple Street Diner. Same time, same route, same corner booth by the window. The booth that caught the afternoon light just right, warming the wood and the hands wrapped around a coffee mug. To the staff, Lillian wasn't just a regular. She was part of the place. When the diner almost shut down years earlier, buried under rising rents and bad months, it was Lillian who quietly connected the owner with a financial advisor. When a waitress's son struggled in school, Lillian tutored him, after her shift never charging $1. When someone needed a recommendation letter, a second chance, or simply someone to listen, Lillian was there. She never bragged. She never announced what she'd done for people. She didn't need recognition. Respect followed her anyway. That morning had started like any other. Lillian rose before sunrise, folded her blanket with practiced care, and watered the plants that lined her window. On the wall were framed photos, former students in graduation caps, handwritten thank you notes, a black and white picture of her late husband smiling beside her at a school fundraiser decades earlier. At 8:05 a.m., her phone rang. "Mom," a man's voice said, calm but warm. "Did you sleep like a stone?" Lillian replied, smiling. "You sound busy." "I am," he said. "But I wanted to check in." "You still going to lunch?" "Of course. Same place, same booth." There was a pause. Not long. Just enough. "You want me to send a driver?" he asked. Lillian laughed softly. "Daniel Brooks, I did not raise you to forget how to walk." "I just worry," he said. "I know," she replied. But worrying never stopped anyone from living. She didn't hear the exhale on the other end of the line. Daniel always did that when he was trying to let go of control. "Call me if you need anything," he said. "I always do." When Lillian arrived at the diner, the booth was waiting. A fresh napkin, a small vase with a single flower. She slid into her seat and set her worn paperback on the table. That was when Charles Whitmore walked in. He didn't belong there, not in his own mind. The diner smelled of grease and coffee, not the kind of place where men like him usually ate. But his usual spot had been booked solid, and inconvenience always put him in a foul mood. He scanned the room like a man surveying territory, and then he saw the booth, the best seat in the house, near the window, quiet, taken by her. His jaw tightened. "I'll take that table," Charles told the waitress, pointing directly at Lillian without lowering his voice. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "That booth is occupied." He frowned. "Then move her." The words landed harder than he realized. Several people looked up. Lillian lifted her eyes from her book. "Excuse me," she said. Charles stepped closer. "That seat is for paying customers." "I am a paying customer," Lillian replied evenly. He laughed a short, humorless sound. "Let's not play games. You should move to another table." "No," she said. Just one word. Calm. Final. That was the moment everything shifted. People like Charles Whitmore weren't used to hearing no, especially not from someone he had already decided didn't matter. His face flushed, and his voice dropped into something colder. "Don't make this difficult," he said. "You're embarrassing yourself." Lillian closed her book and placed it gently on the table. "Sir, I've been coming here longer than you've likely known this street existed. You don't get to remove me." A phone camera came up, then another. Charles reached for the back of her booth. He meant to scare her, to assert dominance, to force her to stand. "Take your hands off the furniture," Lillian said. Instead, his grip tightened. And when she stood not in fear, but in refusal, he struck her. The sound echoed. Lillian staggered half a step, steadied herself, and touched her cheek. She looked around the diner, at the people filming at the staff, frozen in shock, at the man breathing hard in front of her. "I hope," she said softly, "that one day you learn the difference between power and cruelty." Charles scoffed. "You're nothing," he said. "Just another old woman who forgot her place." Lillian met his eyes, and for the first time that day, someone in that diner felt afraid. Not of the man who hit her, but of the quiet certainty in her voice when she replied, "I know exactly who I am." In the corner of the diner, a man in a dark jacket stood up and walked out, already dialing a number. Across the city, Daniel Brooks's phone lit up, and the world Charles Whitmore thought he controlled began slowly to turn against him. Charles Whitmore had spent his life believing certain things were his by default. The best seat, the loudest voice, the final word. He didn't need anyone to grant him permission. Money had done that years ago. As he stood near the entrance of Maple Street Diner, Charles felt the familiar irritation crawl up his spine. The place was beneath him too small, too ordinary, but inconvenience had a way of making him reckless. He'd already circled the block twice. His calls had gone unanswered. His patience was gone. Then he saw the booth. Corner seat. Window light. Privacy. Control. The kind of table that didn't just offer comfort, but status. And sitting there was a woman who in Charles's mind violated the unspoken order of things. She wasn't loud. She wasn't causing a scene. That was almost worse. She sat with her back straight, a book closed neatly in front of her, as if she belonged there, as if the space had been waiting for her. Charles told himself it wasn't personal, but everything about his reaction said otherwise. He walked forward with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged in a room like this. The diner staff felt it immediately. People like Charles didn't raise their voices at first. They tested boundaries, quietly expecting compliance. "I want that table," he said, pointing. The waitress hesitated. "Sir, that booth is taken." Charles exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. "Then take care of it." She didn't move. That was strike one. When Lillian Brooks looked up at him, Charles felt something twist in his chest. Not fear, but offense. The offense of being seen, of being assessed by someone he had already dismissed. She didn't glare. She didn't flinch. She simply waited. "I'm not moving," she said calmly, when he made his demand clearer. The word landed heavier than shouting ever could. No. Charles's entire adult life had been built around eliminating that word. Contracts, settlements, donations, threats. He had mastered the art of polite coercion, making people believe they were choosing what he had already decided. This woman wasn't playing that game. "You don't understand," he said, his voice lowering. "That seat isn't meant for you." Lillian tilted her head slightly. "It's a chair," she replied, "not a throne." A few people nearby stifled smiles. Charles noticed. His jaw tightened. This wasn't about seating anymore. It was about hierarchy. He leaned closer, invading her space. "You think this is cute? Acting brave." "I think," Lillian said, "that you're confusing inconvenience with entitlement." That word entitlement hit him like an insult. Charles glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes on him. The phones. The subtle shift in the room. A younger man at the counter had already started recording. Charles registered it and dismissed it just as quickly. Videos could be buried. People could be intimidated. He reached for the back of the booth, gripping it as if the furniture itself had offended him. "Stand up," he said. The command was reflexive, learned, used on waitstaff assistants, interns, anyone he believed should yield. Lillian stood. Not because he told her to, because she chose to. And that distinction enraged him. "I've lived long enough," she said, her voice steady, "to know when someone is trying to take something that doesn't belong to them." "What you don't understand," Charles snapped, "is that everything belongs to someone like me." That was the truth as he saw it. Property, people, silence. When Lillian didn't back away, when she didn't apologize or lower her gaze, Charles felt the familiar itch of losing control. His hand moved, not calculated, not strategic, just instinct. The slap came fast, not dramatic, not cinematic, just violent. The room froze. Charles felt the shock ripple outward, but instead of regret, he felt relief. The kind that comes from asserting dominance, from restoring what he believed was order. He straightened his jacket, his breathing uneven. "Next time," he said coldly, "know your place." Lillian didn't collapse. She didn't plead. She steadied herself and looked at him not with anger, but with disappointment. "You confuse force with strength," she said. "That's going to cost you." Charles scoffed. He had heard threats before. Empty ones. Emotional ones. People always thought they had leverage they didn't. He didn't notice the way the diner had changed. The silence wasn't fear anymore. It was judgment. A woman near the door whispered, "Did he really just do that?" Someone else said, "I got it on video." The waitress's hand shook as she dialed her phone. Charles turned toward the exit, convinced the moment was over. He had places to be, meetings to attend, a life to continue. What he failed to understand was this: the moment wasn't ending. It was spreading. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the sidewalk as a man in a dark jacket stepped away from the window. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had seen enough. He made one call. Across the city, in an office where silence carried weight, a phone vibrated on a desk. Daniel Brooks picked it up. "Someone put their hands on your mother," the voice said. There was a pause. Not panic. Not disbelief. Just a quiet shift in the air like pressure building before a storm. Where Daniel asked. The answer came. And with it, the beginning of something Charles Whitmore had never accounted for. Because some seats aren't owned. They're earned. And some people don't need to raise their voices to move the world beneath your feet. The call reached Daniel Brooks while the room was still speaking in half sentences. The restaurant in Little Italy was closed to the public that afternoon, but the kitchen was running. Low heat, slow service, the kind of place where decisions were made without witnesses. A long table sat in the back, polished dark wood, surrounded by men who didn't raise their voices and didn't need to. Daniel sat at the head jacket, off sleeves rolled, just enough to show he was working, not performing. Papers were spread in front of him, shipping routes, port schedules, insurance reports, legitimate businesses on paper, necessary ones beneath it. He listened more than he spoke. Always had. Someone was in the middle of explaining a problem at the Newark docks when the vibration came across the table. Daniel glanced down at his phone. Unknown number. He didn't answer it at first. He never did. He let it ring once more, watching the caller ID light up again. Then he lifted a finger. The room went quiet immediately. He stepped away, pushing open the door to a small side office that smelled faintly of espresso and old leather. He closed the door behind him. "This is Brooks," he said. There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice he trusted, measured, controlled, but carrying an edge he rarely heard. "Someone put their hands on your mother." Daniel didn't react, not outwardly. He sat down in the chair by the desk and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His face didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to tighten around him. "Say that again," he said quietly. They slapped her. In a diner. In public. Daniel closed his eyes. For a moment, images tried to surface his mother at the stove humming. His mother grading papers late at night. His mother standing straight no matter who spoke down to her. He pushed them away. Emotion had its place. This wasn't it. "Is she hurt?" he asked. Bruised. Shaken. Still standing. A fraction of tension left his shoulders. Just enough. Where Daniel asked, "Maple Street, Harlem." Daniel nodded to himself. Who did it? The name came through the phone. Charles Whitmore. Daniel didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. Names meant things to him. Networks, histories, pressure points. Did she call the police, he asked? They're on the way. Videos are already circulating. Daniel exhaled slowly. Good, he said. Then listened carefully. He straightened in his chair. No one touches him, Daniel said. No threats. No warnings. No surprises. We don't move like that. There was hesitation on the other end. Daniel anticipated it. I know what you're thinking, he continued. And if this were anyone else, I might agree with you. But this is my mother. A beat. She raised me better than revenge, he said. And I won't dishonor her by choosing it now. When Daniel ended the call, he sat still for a full 10 seconds. Then he stood and returned to the table, No one spoke as he took his seat again. They didn't need to ask what had happened. They could feel it. When Daniel Brooks changed temperature rooms, noticed. "Change of agenda," he said calmly. One of the men leaned forward. Boss Daniel looked at him. "I want everything on Charles Whitmore. Financials, legal history, social ties, quietly." Another man spoke. "Timeline, I want to know who he answers to," Daniel said, "and who he thinks answers to him." A third man shifted in his chair. "You want him gone?" Daniel shook his head. "I want him exposed." They understood the difference. Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time it was his mother. He answered immediately. "Mom," he said. "I didn't want you to hear about this from anyone else," Lillian said. Her voice was steady, but older now. Tired in a way Daniel hated. "I know," he replied. "I'm listening." "He was angry," she said. "Not because of the seat. Because I didn't move." Daniel closed his eyes again. "I told him he was wrong," she continued. "And he didn't like that." "I'm sorry you went through that," Daniel said. "I'm not," Lillian replied gently. "I've lived long enough to know that some people reveal themselves when they're challenged. I just didn't expect him to use his hand." Daniel swallowed. "They're going to want to talk to you," he said. "Reporters, lawyers, people who think they're helping." "I won't say anything yet," she said. "You taught me to be careful." He smiled faintly at that. "I learned it from you." There was a pause. "Daniel," she said, lowering her voice, "promise me something. Anything. No violence," she said. "I don't want this turning into something ugly." Daniel's answer was immediate. "I promise," he said. "This stays clean." When the call ended, Daniel sat with the phone in his hand longer than necessary. Then he began to work. By nightfall, the city was already responding. The video had crossed 1 million views. Then 2. Then more. News outlets picked it up, not because it was shocking, but because it was clear. There was no angle that favored Whitmore, no version where his actions looked justified. Daniel watched none of it. Instead, he placed calls to a woman in the district attorney's office who still kept a thank you note from Lillian Brooks in her desk drawer, to a former city council aide who owed his first job to a recommendation written in careful handwriting 20 years earlier, to a labor attorney who had once been tutored by Lillian after school because his parents worked nights. Daniel didn't ask for favors. He reminded people of who his mother was. The difference mattered. By midnight, Whitmore's name was being flagged in places he didn't know existed: compliance departments, boardrooms, clubs that suddenly remembered their codes of conduct. Daniel sat alone in his office when the final call came through. A quiet confirmation, the first domino tipping. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Some men ruled through fear, some through money. Daniel had learned watching his mother that the most dangerous kind of power came from something else entirely: a lifetime of dignity, and a single moment when the world decided to pay attention. By the next morning, Charles Whitmore's face was everywhere, and for once, it wasn't on a charity gala program or a glossy real estate magazine. It was on phones, on morning shows, on local news in New York, then Chicago, then Los Angeles, as anchors replayed the same brutal clip with the same stunned tone: a well-dressed man stepping into a diner, demanding a seat, and slapping a 73-year-old black woman for refusing to move. The video didn't need commentary. It didn't need edits or dramatic music. The truth had its own sound. The slap, the silence, the way Lillian Brooks stayed on her feet. People posted it with one sentence that kept repeating like a heartbeat across the country. This could have been my mother. Hashtags rose not because someone planned a campaign, but because regular people recognized something familiar in the moment. Justice for Lillian. Respect has no color. Sit where you belong. The comments weren't just angry. They were personal. Men in their 40s wrote about watching their moms get ignored at hospitals. Women in their 50s wrote about being too black for one space and too old for another. Grandchildren posted photos of their grandmothers in church hats saying protect her at all costs. Meanwhile, the internet did what it always does. When it smells arrogance, it started digging. Charles Whitmore's name didn't stay a name for long. People pulled up his LinkedIn, his public donations, his real estate company website, his photos, shaking hands with politicians, his country club membership page. Someone found an interview where he joked about cleaning up neighborhoods. Someone else found a zoning fight where residents had accused his company of pushing out longtime tenants. It didn't prove he was guilty of everything people said about him, but it painted a picture, and that picture matched the man in the video. More importantly, it made corporations nervous. By lunchtime, Whitmore's inbox was flooding with something he wasn't used to silence from the people who usually protected him. The first blow came from his own investors. An email, short and polite, from a fund manager who had never spoken to him that way before. We're pausing our relationship pending review. Then another. Our board is concerned about reputational risk. Then a third. We're requiring a formal statement and immediate action. Reputational risk. Those words had ended careers faster than any courtroom ever could. His country club followed. A formal notice delivered by a staff member who looked like he wished he didn't have to be the messenger. Membership privileges temporarily suspended, effective immediately, while the conduct committee reviews recent events. Whitmore read it twice, stunned. He'd always believed those rooms were made to cushion men like him. In Harlem, the Maple Street Diner was living through a different kind of storm. The owner kept the blinds half closed because strangers kept showing up. Some were kind. Some were hungry for spectacle. Reporters asked staff to reenact what happened. People tried to sit in the booth where Lillian had been snapping selfies like the place was a museum of pain. Lillian refused to let it become that. When a local producer asked her for an interview, she answered with the same calm firmness she used on teenagers decades ago. "I'm not here for fame," she said. "I'm here for accountability." That word accountability was the bridge between outrage and action. And action was already moving through the system, quietly, deliberately, the way it should have moved for others long before Lillian. At the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Klein arrived early. She wasn't assigned to the case on paper. She didn't need to be. She asked for the file anyway. Rebecca wasn't dramatic. She was the kind of prosecutor who built cases like scaffolding, patient, precise, unshakable. But when she saw Lillian Brooks's name on the report, something tightened behind her ribs. Lillian had been Rebecca's 9th grade English teacher. Not the kind that let you slide. not the kind that praised you for showing up. Lillian had expected excellence, especially from kids who'd never been told they could reach it. Rebecca still remembered the day she'd gotten into trouble for mouthing off in class, sharp defensive, embarrassed by how smart she was. Lillian had held her after school and said softly, "You don't have to fight for respect by swinging first. Make them face you with their own rules." Now, Rebecca opened the evidence folder and felt the weight of those words. Multiple angles, clear audio, the demand for the seat, the strike, the aftermath. No confusion, no ambiguity. Rebecca didn't smile. She didn't celebrate the easy part. She knew how quickly easy cases got mishandled when the defendant had money. She called her investigator into the room. "I want every witness contacted today," she said. "I want their statements recorded, signed, and preserved. I want the diner's security footage pulled before someone loses it. And I want Whitmore's phone seized under warrant before he can scrub anything." The investigator raised an eyebrow. "We don't usually move this fast." Rebecca looked up. "We do now." Across town, in a courthouse office that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, Judge Eleanor Ruiz read the preliminary brief. She didn't comment publicly. Judges didn't. But she wrote 2 lines on a yellow legal pad and underlined them twice. Pattern, message. 'Cause this wasn't only about a slap. It was about what the slap represented. The belief that some people could be moved physically, socially, morally, because someone else wanted their space. The system finally working didn't look like a single heroic speech. It looked like paperwork done correctly, like calls returned, like evidence secured, like a case file treated with urgency instead of inconvenience. It also looked like people finding courage. By midweek, the first former employee of Whitmore's company contacted a civil rights attorney, then a second. They didn't have a video of what happened to them. They didn't have a diner full of witnesses. But they had stories they'd kept quiet because they'd been taught that speaking up was expensive. Now, they saw a crack in the wall. One woman, a project coordinator in her early 50s, said Whitmore used to call her aggressive when she asked for the same resources her white colleagues got. Another man said he'd watched Whitmore humiliate a maintenance worker in a lobby, calling him boy, with a smile that dared anyone to challenge it. A tenant described being pressured to leave an apartment building after complaining about mold, then being offered a generous buyout if she'd just sign and stop talking. None of those claims convicted Whitmore on their own. But they did something just as important. They showed consistency. They showed a pattern that made the diner video feel less like a one-time loss of temper and more like a window into who he was when he thought he could get away with it. Whitmore's public relations team finally pushed him to release a statement. He tried to write it like he was a victim of misunderstanding. He mentioned stress. He mentioned a heated moment. He avoided naming Lillian. He avoided the word slap. The public didn't accept it. Neither did the people who mattered most to his career, the institutions that feared becoming collateral damage. The next statement came from his own company's board. It was clean corporate language with a sharp edge underneath Mr. Whitmore has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Administrative leave was the polite way of saying, "You're too toxic to stand next to." In a quiet office late that night, Daniel Brooks sat with his hands folded listening to a report. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He watched the system do what it had ignored for others. He thought of his mother, Lillian, standing in that diner, refusing to surrender her dignity for someone else's comfort. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something rare. Not rage, not fear. A steady, sober sense of inevitability. Because when the system finally worked, it wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was the result of a woman who'd spent a lifetime teaching people how to stand tall until one day enough of them stood tall for her. Power didn't end the way Charles Whitmore expected it to. It didn't explode. It didn't humiliate him in a single dramatic moment. It rewrote him slowly, publicly, and without mercy. The sentencing came on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of day that makes courthouses feel heavier than usual. Whitmore stood at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit the man he used to be. The confidence that once radiated from him had collapsed inward, replaced by the brittle posture of someone learning too late that status doesn't protect you from consequence. The judge spoke plainly. No flourish, no lecture, just facts. Assault, aggravated harassment, bias-motivated conduct. The words landed with finality. Whitmore was ordered to serve time followed by supervised probation and mandatory community service at a senior center in the South Bronx. He would attend sensitivity training. He would pay restitution. He would not be allowed to hide behind corporate boards or private clubs while doing it. When the gavel struck, no one applauded. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a correction. Lillian Brooks sat quietly in the second row, hands folded in her lap. She wore a simple navy coat and the same calm expression she'd carried into the diner weeks earlier. When the judge glanced at her, Lillian nodded once, not in gratitude, but in acknowledgement. The system had done its job. That was enough. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Cameras pointed. Questions shouted. Mrs. Brooks, how do you feel? Lillian paused before answering. I feel hopeful, she said. Not because someone was punished, but because someone was heard. That sentence traveled farther than the video ever had. In the weeks that followed, life changed in ways no one had planned. Whitmore reported every Saturday morning to the South Bronx Senior Center, where folding tables were set up for meal prep and coat drives. His supervisor was Angela Morales, 78 years old, a retired social worker with sharp eyes and no patience for ego. You're not special here, she told him on his first day. You're early, you're polite, and you listen. That's how this works. Whitmore nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't smile. The work was simple and exhausting. Serving meals to people his own age. Listening to stories he'd never cared to hear before. Watching men and women with far less than he'd ever had still show up for each other with dignity and tact. No one yelled at him. No one insulted him. That was worse. Meanwhile, Lillian refused to let the moment fade into memory. With help from former students' neighbors and a handful of lawyers who still remembered the woman who'd stayed late to help them find their voices, she founded the Brooks Dignity Initiative. The mission was simple support victims of bias-based harassment before silence could swallow them. The initiative offered legal referrals, counseling, and advocacy training. It partnered with small businesses to establish clear protocols for handling harassment. It taught people how to document, how to speak, how to stand their ground without losing themselves. At the launch event, held in a modest community hall in Harlem, Lillian stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. Faces young and old, black, white, Latino, Asian. Some had come for support. Some had come to say thank you. "I didn't plan this," she said. "I didn't wake up one morning wanting to become a symbol. I wanted a sandwich and a quiet seat by the window." Soft laughter rippled through the room. "But if something good can come from what happened," she continued, "then we have a responsibility to build on it, not with anger, with structure." In the back of the room, Daniel Brooks listened without stepping forward. He had stayed deliberately out of sight throughout the process. No interviews, no statements, no reminders of who he was or what he controlled. That restraint had been harder than any show of force. After the event, he found his mother near the exit. "You did this," he said quietly. Lillian smiled. "We did this together." And with a lot of people who finally felt safe enough to stand up. Daniel nodded. "I've spent my life thinking power meant making people afraid of crossing you." And now, she asked, "And now I see it means making people unafraid to stand where they are." She reached for his hand, squeezing it once. "That's all I ever wanted you to learn." Months later, Maple Street Diner still served the same food, the same booths, the same window light, but something subtle had changed. There was a sign near the door now, not flashy, not performative, just clear. "Harassment will not be tolerated. All guests are entitled to dignity." People noticed. A woman once told the owner she felt safer bringing her mother there now. A man apologized to a waitress for a comment he'd made years earlier. A teenager asked Lillian for advice on handling a teacher who spoke down to her. Even Whitmore noticed. One Saturday afternoon, while stacking boxes at the senior center, he overheard a woman telling another volunteer, "That Brooks lady, she's the reason my sister finally filed her complaint." Whitmore didn't speak. He just listened. For the first time in his life, he understood what real influence looked like. Not fear, not money, not force. Consistency, integrity, time. On a quiet Sunday evening, Daniel and Lillian sat at her kitchen table sharing tea. The city hummed outside the window. "You know, Daniel said people think I change things." Lillian looked at him. "People think a lot of things." "You change them," he said, "by staying seated." She smiled, tired but content. "Power isn't about moving others," she said. "It's about refusing to be moved when you're right." Daniel leaned back, absorbing it. Somewhere across the city, Charles Whitmore finished another shift and walked home without anyone recognizing him. The world hadn't ended for him. It had simply stopped revolving around him. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful rewrite of all. This story was never really about a slap in a diner. It was about what happened after, and more importantly, what happened because one woman refused to surrender her dignity. Lillian Brooks didn't set out to become a symbol. She didn't ask for attention, protection, or sympathy. She did what she had always done. She sat where she belonged, spoke with calm clarity, and held her ground without hatred. In a single moment of cruelty, Charles Whitmore revealed the kind of power he believed in, the kind that demands obedience and uses fear when it's challenged. But that kind of power has an expiration date. What followed wasn't revenge. There were no threats in dark alleys, no whispered orders, no shortcuts. Instead, something far more unsettling unfolded for a man like Whitmore. The system he assumed would protect him finally worked against him. Slowly, publicly, permanently. And behind that shift stood a quiet truth. Lillian Brooks had spent her entire life investing in people, not influence. She taught, mentored, listened, and believed in others long before it was convenient. When she was harmed, those people didn't rise out of obligation. They rose out of gratitude, out of memory, out of respect. Her son, Daniel Brooks, understood something many never learn. Real power isn't proven by how quickly you can destroy someone. It's proven by whether you can restrain yourself and still win. He honored his mother, not by unleashing fear, but by letting integrity do the work fear never could. In doing so, he learned that legacy isn't built in moments of domination, but in moments of discipline. The lesson here isn't abstract, it's practical. It applies to everyday life. Dignity is not passive, it's active restraint. It's choosing to respond instead of react. It's knowing your worth so clearly that you don't need to shout it. When you carry yourself with consistency and principle, you build a reputation that speaks for you when you're no longer in the room. Another lesson is this: systems don't change because of outrage alone. They change when people who understand them decide to act with courage and precision. Documentation matters. Witnesses matter. Speaking up matters even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it feels late. And perhaps the most important truth of all power rooted in cruelty is fragile. Power rooted in character is durable. Every one of us will face moments big or small where we're tested, where it would be easier to shrink, to stay quiet, to move seats. This story asks a simple question. When that moment comes, will you stand your ground with grace? If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think differently about power, dignity, and justice, then you're exactly why this channel exists. We tell these stories not just to entertain, but to remind us of who we can be. Subscribe to the channel to support more stories like this, stories that go deeper, ask harder questions, and spotlight quiet strength in a noisy world. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating meaningful content that matters. Because you never know who's watching the way you live. And you never know how much power you're building just by choosing dignity.